Good afternoon, good evening, and good night wherever you are in the world. My name is Tony Cealy, and I am a drama and theatre practitioner who's been using drama and theatre techniques for over 25 years, working with communities to solve community issues and look at behaviour change amongst our Black community. The project that I am working on with many awesome people is called 81 Acts of Exuberant Defiance. It's a large cultural experiment that's taking place in Brixton to mark the 40th anniversary of the 1981 uprisings. And to date, we have galvanized a large mass of people from Brixton, about nearly 80 people who are part of the steering group that help us build and develop this mammoth, exciting, exuberant project. Essentially, we want to have 81 acts of defiance activities spread across next year, 2021. And we've got a range of partners and loads of ideas and lots of theory of changes and lots of manifestos and lots of ways into this project. But we need the community to come on board and help us make it what it is for them. So there is a complete legacy left for Brixton. And today, being the 3rd of August, I am joined by my loyal comrade, Mr. Lee Jasper, legend. From back in the day to the front of today. The man Debolt, large, extremely big up in chess in a Brixton, and he does a regular Saturday morning drive time show. Sometimes you find it on different Saturdays, but more time he does a wicked drive time show, and he's joined me today as a wonderful guest to talk and reason about Brixton and 81 and this project, on how you can find out what it is, how to get involved, and the future of 81 Acts of Exuberant Defiance. Lee Jasper.
Yes, Mr. Cealy, legendary, only overshadowed by your gigantic artistic presence as a community activist here in Brixton. It's great to be talking about 81 Acts of Exuberant Defiance. People may say, well, what is there to celebrate? And what do you mean by exuberant defiance? Well, of course, we're talking about an artistic program, whether that's music, whether that's art installation, or whether that's a happening on a street, a dance. We're thinking of many, many ways in which we can rethink the whole 1981 disturbances, which did fundamentally change Britain. I think we all agree on that. 81 ended the Sus Law, which was the most dreaded apartheid-like legislation that Black communities have ever witnessed, and which thousands of innocent Black people went to jail. And just to remind people about Sus, it was being arrested on suspicion of committing a crime to people and property unknown. And the only evidence that you needed that you were about to commit a crime to people and property unknown was a police officer who said you looked like you was about to commit a crime to people or property unknown. And would you believe it? People went in front of magistrates and got sent to jail for that crime. So 81 abolished that, but it also fundamentally changed our relationship with the police, because out of all 81 came all that anti-racist police training provision that people like Paul Batang and others, you remember that training session that Paul Batang did, Tony, where he asked them to, this is before he was an MP, when he was a solicitor, where he asked them at a training college to write, officers to write anonymously what they thought about race relations. And he got them back. They couldn't believe what he had in front of him. And he leaked it to the press because it was like a British National Party manifesto. And it was a big story at the time, and it led to a complete reevaluation of relations with the police. And of course, local authorities and councils started to pay attention to the needs of the Black community. And at that time, we had an explosion of community centre investments. We all remember them. Supplementary schools began to take off. There was additional money provided for all sorts. I was a beneficiary. I did that access course thing, whereas if you didn't have any qualifications, you left school without any qualifications, and you went and did a foundation course that they actually paid for you to do a degree. If you got an automatic university place if you passed the foundation course. And okay, I went to it straight from, I came out of prison in strange ways and did that straight away. And I got my degree and I never looked back since. So, and I know there's thousands of people who either got employed in community centres or got degrees as a consequence of access course, or were no longer subject to the gross criminalisation of the SUS law. And all of that can be credited to the 81 Acts.
Absolutely, absolutely. And and it's also, it feels like it's also about not only just art and culture and heritage, but it's also about politics and social policy, very much so that you know, we want to look at that whole change of systemic oppression for Black people. So I think you know, having some inputs from the social policy sector or drive or areas is equally important for this 81 Acts. And I'm really hoping that we've got, you know, people like yourselves and I can't even remember, Gus John showed an interest back in the day. I need to chase him up. Cecil, loads of people that were involved at the time are willing to do something and make a contribution to this exciting mammoth of a project.
And I think that's what's exciting about it, because it gives us an opportunity to reappraise these events, to rethink about them. I think the thing is about Black resistance is that it's to injustice. It's always demonized, isn't it? As overtly criminal, as a bad thing. One never looks back fondly on Black uprisings in the United Kingdom unless you're Black and took part in them and you were suffering at the time. Absolutely. In which case you think it was a glorious day. Notwithstanding that people were pressured to such an extent that, you know, mayhem and violence takes place. Nobody wishes that on any community.
No.
I think there comes a time in any community's life when the oppression is so great that where there isn't the normal avenues of justice and access to justice, that these things become understandable and probably quite necessary if you're going to remove the justice, take their foot off our necks, if we use a modern day analogy. But absolutely quite. I'm always amazed that, you know, the pride movement, the global pride movement, started with a riot in New York, and it was actually Black trans guys who kicked off that riot. If you read the history, particularly one Black trans guy who got battered, and that riot started, and that was turned into a sort of glorious movement of lesbian and gay revolution, wasn't it? And people all over the world to this day celebrate Pride. And yet when it comes to 81, it's looked at through dark coloured spectacles, if I can use that analogy. So I think 81 Acts gives an opportunity to look again at the issues of resistance, legitimacy of resistance, and why it played so much important part in improving British society. You were there back in the day, so what was your 81,000 acts of resistance in 81?
Well, to be honest, it's funny you say that, Lee. I'm going back now. So I grew up in Brixton. I was born on Somerleyton Road and Geneva Road. Geneva Road is no longer there, but it was just around the corner from Somerleyton Road. And I don't know why my mum sent me, my older brothers, to a school in Battersea. And so we used to travel from Brixton to Battersea every day to go to school. And I do remember, because being the youngest out of four brothers, having to defend myself at school when my brothers left school. Your brother's not here now more. We can do you in, Cealy. And yeah, it was a lot of that. But I do remember back then at school, galvanizing with other friends, black boys, and we would just form our own resistant groups because, as you know, Lee, at the time, Teddy boys were rife, skinheads were rife. Coming home from school was like, you know, a minefield. To get from Battersea back to Brixton safely was always it was a Dragon's Den run through. So for me, it was about, yeah, teaming up with your brethren, them, and forming some kind of resistance. So that was like school. But then even living on the estate in Stockwell, you know, I remember very much that lots of boys got together and just formed posses, because you just never knew when you were traveling wherever you were in London that, you know, people would want to attack you for the color of your skin. So you had to kind of form some kind of resistance, you know, to make sure that, you know, you were protected as the best way as possible.
I think that's right. I certainly remember in my school days, back in Manchester, when we came out of our immediate area, we used to jog through those areas because it was always very useful to have a head start on anybody that was coming to chase you. So as soon as we entered foreign territory, we start a light jog just in case. And that always served us well because we needed to get away very quickly. But I think that for me in 81, you know, what I recall is just the overwhelming sense of, I think what we used to call it back in those days, down-pression. And it was the weight of the police who were overtly racist in a way that you couldn't even imagine today. You know, I remember officers, you know, smashing you against the wall, saying, nigger, what you're doing in this area, we're gonna do you, you know, seeing my mates get battered in police stations. I mean, people just can't figure and imagine the level of oppression and injustice we face. And that was just from the police.
Yeah.
And I think the thing is about 81, of course, is that in January of that year, we suffered the most brutal mass murder of black people ever witnessed in our history, in our modern history. And that is, of course, the New Crossfire disaster. And I remember in 81, people were shouting 81 dead and nothing said. This is for you. And you'll remember in March of that year, with Darcus Howe and lots of other people from Lewisham, one of the biggest black marches ever. So when 81 came around, and you know, if you remember the swamp policing tactics, Swamp 81, that's what the operation was called. Swamp 81. And if that's like 3,000 officers in less than a square mile that is searching everybody and everything that moved. And of course, no community could suffer that amount of police oppression. So I remember the sense of almost relief. And I know Frantz Fanon talks about this issue of violence of the oppressed in many of his books as a French post-colonial psychologist and sociologist. And I must admit, that's what I felt at the time as a young man. A sense of relief that we were finally doing something to push the oppressor's foot back up our necks. I know many won't agree with that and think, you know, what's he talking about? But you had to be there, you had to be part of it. And I think it's part of the fundamental reappraisal of 81 itself, that sometimes violence can be justified when people are so oppressed that there is no other legitimate means for them to access justice.
You know, when I was growing up in Brixton back in the late 70s and early 80s, I do remember feeling very much at home because of the landscape and the environment. You know, it was almost like if you're in Jamaica, as you know, if you pass every certain 100 yards or whatever, you're either going to buck up on a church or a sound system. Now in Brixton, you kind of had the same with the kind of black pubs or the youth clubs or the, you know, the estates where black people would be. And integrated within that, you'd find other, white people and other nationalities all living harmoniously in Brixton. But I do remember all of the kind of places like the black pubs and the estates, and that was in a way part of the resistance, these landscape infrastructure buildings, places where you could go and meet other like-minded folk. And that for me growing up was part of a kind of sense of home and resistance. And all of that, unfortunately, you know, fast forward 39 years, you know, Brixton's been whitewashed, as we know. But back in the day, there was a lot of resistance, you know, even down to my older brother, you know, wanting to join the Black Panthers and stuff. And, you know, being parts of different movements was that the heyday.
Mm. I think you're right. And I think that you go into Brixton now, it's like cultural apartheid. There are people who buy in food and drinks that we can't afford to eat, while you've got black grandmothers looking for, you know, ackee and saltfish on the stalls just over the road. And we don't know how long those stalls will be there if development continues at the same pace. So Brixton now looks like a form of cultural apartheid on very many evenings. Go down there any Friday and Saturday. But I think you're right. I think that's the other misconception about Brixton, that it was a black riot. Yes, it was lots of black people who were involved, and young people for sure, but all sorts of people were involved in that uprising from all sorts of communities, and all sorts of communities, you know, were supportive of the black community in terms of its level of resistance. And I think that, you know, the Scarman inquiry that followed the 81, you know, gave a context for that and said, look, you know, you can't be policing people in this way and expect them to tolerate it in a way. And of course, 81, then again in 86, you know, Notting Hill, and 81 didn't just happen in Brixton, of course. It happened in Moss Side, it happened in Liverpool, it happened in Chapeltown, it happened in Birmingham. It sparked a defiance that was right across the country. It's almost, Brixton was the black capital of Black England. And once it went, I think it's now the black capital of Black Europe, of Europe. But,
absolutely. And there's something about Brixton that, you know, that wherever you are in the world and you tell somebody where you're from and you say Brixton, they kind of go, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, it's synonymous like with Bob Marley, isn't it? It's like everybody knows Brixton's name. You just, you know, and it's funny, you know, going back to that point about regeneration. When I moved to Brixton 35 years ago, people used to raise their eyebrows when I told them where they lived, to say, oh, have you moved your family there? How'd you cope with the crime and this, that, and the other? And like you, I just found it a lovely place to be. I mean, I had never had any problems. Fast forward 35 years later, and they say, where do you live? I say, Brixton. Their eyebrows are raised and say, how do you afford to live there? So just shows you how times have changed.
Absolutely.
But I think, look, 81 Acts is going to take a long, hard look backwards and reimagine.
Yes.
And celebrate the way in which it contributed to improving British society in terms of forcing the issue of race relations and policing onto the national political agenda, as well as look at the explosion of culture even at the time. Because, you know, 1981, what you're talking about, you know, the music, the fashion, the Linton Kwesi Johnson, you know, the sound systems, Saxon sound systems.
Coxton,
I mean,
you name it. Yeah, they were
blues parties back in the day. It's the equivalent of the block party today, isn't it?
Yeah.
The blues party of yesterday.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think if you think about, I suppose, you know, just after the riots, or even maybe even say just before the riots.
Uprisings.
Yeah, the uprisings. I mean, we're talking about resistance. Let's just talk about the front line. I mean, that's right at the edge of resistance, the front line. I mean, whoever gave it that name, I don't know how that name came about, but obviously it still rings true very much today.
No, absolutely. Whether it's Railton Road, whether it's All Saints Road, whether it's the Black and White Cafe in St. Paul's, whether it's Alexandra Road in Moss Side, whether it's Granby Street in Toxteth, I can name you the front lines, largely because my misspent youth, I travelled all around them. And they all had this fierce resistance against police oppression.
Yeah.
And police had to step very tenderly when they went onto the streets. And if you like, there was a whole period from the 70s, 80s, where there was a constant battle between front lines and policing in terms of police racism, operational racism in terms of their racial profile in the black communities, and the resistance that we found on those lines. But Railton Road was, I don't know which was out of the two, Railton Road and All Saints Road, I think are the two premier front lines.
Yes.
And by that, I mean, they had those lines locked in West and South London.
Absolutely.
For real.
Yeah. And I think what I remember as a youth, you know, going down to the front line, you know, was just seeing all the other communities that were living there, because there were lots of gay people living down the front line and beyond, going up until up to Herne Hill. There were some sort of like the ska mods, rockers kind of people living down that way, and all got on harmoniously, you know. So it's like the face of the front line was, like, you could say it was black, but when you went beyond it, it just got whiter and whiter, you know, and everyone just got on all together along that front line there. And as you say, you know, so much organization and strategic planning was going on in different pockets of those front lines, whether it was sitting down at a cafe reasoning and chatting to somebody, or, you know, planning with the youth or sound systems. It was all part of that resistance front to keep, you know, the area safe and available for anybody to just be part of something, you know, very, very important, you know.
I think the irony is, given the public perception about front lines, is that they were actually safe spaces for many people.
Yes.
They weren't unsafe spaces in that sense. They were safe. They were unsafe if you didn't know what you were doing. But any space is unsafe if you don't know what you're doing. But they were safe spaces for lots of people. And to be fair, you know, white, rich London headed down to Brixton, headed over to Mangrove at Notting Hill, you know, headed over to the dark spaces of the blues and the shebeen every Friday and Saturday night to go and party. And they never had a problem in doing so. So, you know, it was this curious mix where perceptually for the outsider, it looked, as you described, as a sort of black, you know, anarchic space. But for those who lived there and those who went there, they found the most, you know, remarkable acts of solidarity and exuberant comradeship, if I can use that word, in those areas. And yeah, of course, there was, you know, drunken violence and so on and so forth, but they were in English pubs and English working class towns all over the country. So that was no exception there. The thing that marked us out is resistance to police racism. And I think that makes out things like Railton Road and All Saints Road, is Railton Road and the Race Today collective with Darcus Howe established there. In All Saints Road, there's the Mangrove and Frank Critchlow, you know, and these early pioneers of black self-organisation, and Olive Morris, as we know, has been memorialised in Brixton. Should have a statue with her with that bullhorn in Windrush Square, in my view. But all of these individuals spawned out of the revolutionary culture that was catalysed by the 81 disturbances. So I think there's a lot to look back on. There's a lot to celebrate. There's a lot to reflect on. And I'm really looking forward to it next year. I think it's going to be quite an exciting and opportune time to rethink, reimagine. And look at the
looking back at the resistance back then to the resistance kind of now in, you know, 2020, it's a complete different kind of change, but the same issues are still going on. The same oppression is still here. You know, you won't really meet people of color black people who are gonna kind of say, well, yeah, I feel valued by white society today. You know, it's rare to find anybody who will be speaking in that kind of way.
No, I think you're right. I think what we've seen is a continued process of marginalisation, notwithstanding the pushback of 81. But this is the key thing, because if you look at the progress made outside of the context of uprisings and civil disturbances, that progress has been glacial. It's been slow. It's been lethargic. Look at the movement since the Black Lives Matter movement. People and companies are making decisions about reparations and finding additional money. Things that you and I thought we'd never see in our lifetime have happened. Why? Because people all over the world has just had the biggest anti-racist demonstration in human history.
Yeah.
You know, in the aftermath of George Floyd. And I think that shows us that, you know, where you can build allyship and you can get traction amongst the vast majority, you can then begin to do things that were previously unheard of. And you and I were at the reparations march this weekend, you know, and that was a spectacular cultural event. Yes. You know, and people from all communities, all faiths, all colours supporting the issue of reparations. And I think there are some lessons in that will also be useful to learn in any reflection of 1981.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for 81 Acts, it feels like it's open for people to be part of and come and get involved. But there is a structure. There is a sense of, well, what is happening next and what will happen and how you might get involved, as opposed to, I suppose, you know, we've seen, as you said, Lee, at the weekend with the reparations march, there's been lots of people come in, convene, lots of fireworks, but what else? What else are we learning? What else do we know? What else are we moving on to around reparations? And my personal opinion is that, you know, it goes dark now until next summer, when they will build up another reparations kind of activity. And I'm hoping that with 81, we can really leave a legacy for Brixton that has never been seen before, you know, across arts and culture, across environment in buildings, and just with the actual people who can make a difference, particularly the young generation coming up, can actually really feel and be part of something that is about their legacy growing up, as opposed to nothing's happened. Well, I'm really hoping with 81 Acts of Exuberant Defiance is that we do see this legacy embedded in the fabric of Brixton.
Well, I think you're right, and I think that we're working hard to make sure that there is a legacy. When you look at the assets that were gained through 81, the Brixton Recreation Centre, why isn't that back in community control? The buildings that we used to have in relation to elderly clubs and youth clubs, all of that has now gone. So if there was a positive legacy in addition to the arts and cultural aspects and the reimagining of 81 back into a sort of narrative that explains, you know, Black liberation culture within urban culture within Brixton, it would also by leaving some physical assets. And the thing is that the door is open for people to get involved. We're not talking about something in which people can't get involved, can't create their own acts of exuberant defiance, can't contact us to get involved with what we're doing, or create something, you know, to remember in their places. And not just, you know, in Brixton. You know, maybe there'll be other people in Liverpool. We're in Brixton because we live here, but there may be other people in Toxteth, in Birmingham, and elsewhere who will also want to look at 81 in terms of this in lens. So we're going to leave stuff on the screen so that people can see where they can get in contact with us. And really, it's an open invitation, isn't it? Come and do your artistic, revolutionary stuff, and let's reimagine 81 Acts of Exuberant Defiance.
Absolutely, and it's for anything goes. There's nothing that we won't accept. I'm obviously, we're not exposed. We're not going to let people burn down buildings and hold petrol bombs, but you know, we are looking for a whole range of ideas, and that's why we really want this exuberant acts of defiance to come forward from the community for the community, and there is something left over so that people can, when they come to Brixton for the first time, you'll know about Brixton in a different way that you don't know up till now.
Absolutely. And one of the assets we're hoping to produce is a digital trail. So
Yes.
as you're walking past spots and places in Brixton, it will come up on your phone about what happened there in 1981. So there's lots of stuff. We're not setting fire to any buildings, so let's just make that clear. But I think we'll have to do something with fire and smoke. It was so evocative of 81 that those elements must be part of a, you know, I'm not an artist, but I'm sure somebody will come up with a safe
Absolutely.
way to reimagine smoke and fire as part of the Brixton backdrop. Tony, been great talking to you, mate. And you know, I'm delighted and honoured to be able to work with 81 acts on the steering group. We've all put a lot of work in, and here's hoping people out there will join us on what is a fantastic artistic journey of remembrance.
Indeed. So if anybody's interested, you can check us on the links at the bottom of this, or you just go to 81actsofexuberance.com and you'll find out much more information. But for now, we want to thank you, and want to thank Lee Jasper, the legend, for being here today. And stay tuned for the next theme that we're going to be dealing with. And big up all of the crew in the 81 Massive.